Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and this is our continuing YouTube series on videos to help you improve your chess game. Today's lecture is one of my all-time favorites. I think so because it's fun and it's fairly original. I don't think I've seen it anywhere else. So you can't say, gee, Dan gave me a video today and I didn't really learn anything. All right, so we're going to start with something really mundane. We're going to start with a king and two pawns against a king, but bear with me for a minute because we're going to build up to something interesting. It'll be a little bit of a puzzle. All right, so white to play. Obviously, white's winning. King g2, black backs off, king g5. Okay, so you could push these two pawns up together, and if you had a rook and pawn endgame, or a knight and pawn endgame, or a bishop and pawn endgame, you want to push those pawns up together. But when you have a king and pawn endgame, you don't need both pawns. So what you can do is just take your non-rook pawn, in this case the g pawn, and just start pushing him up the board. Okay, so black's got to back off. He's going to get into zugzwang. Here, of course, he should go straight back as if you only had one pawn. And when you finally get to this position, instead of stalemating him with king to g6, you say, oh, look, I've got something else on the board. I have a pawn. I'll push it up one. He plays king h7, and I play king f7, king h6. I get a queen. He goes here, check, and checkmate. Okay, so in these kind of positions, a lot of times it's easier to push just one pawn up the board and leave the other pawn as a tempo. But notice you don't need a pawn to do that. It could have been anything on h2. It could be a knight, it could be a bishop. It could even be a rook and a queen, and you can do the same thing. So let's put a knight there. And again, oh, sorry, well, black's in check, so let's move the black king back one. All right, so white to play here. King g2, and we're just going to push the pawn up the board, just like before. Same as if that thing on h2 was a pawn. Doesn't matter what's on h2. And now you take that thing on h2 and don't stalemate him, whatever it is. Make sure not to guard h7. And you move that piece, and he has to play king h7. Okay. Now, obviously, if that was a rook or a queen, we would have moved it out of the way, so that it wouldn't be a stalemate. But, okay, so the point is, when you have a pawn that's not a rook pawn, and you have anything else on the board, you're almost always winning. 99.99% of the time, if you're not losing that pawn and you're not losing the other piece, and you can keep them both safe, then you're winning. And the way you can win with a non-rook pawn and anything else is you just push it up the board, and when you get to that move where you would stalemate him, you just move that other piece, and he has to move out of the way and you win. So that extra tempo means that a king and a pawn that's not a rook pawn will always beat a king with something else that creates a tempo. So now here's the question for today's video. There are several instances where you can have a king and a pawn and something else, and they're all safe. We're not talking about positions where, the defender is immediately winning one of the things. That's a whole different story. We're talking about where you have a king and a non-rook pawn, and you have another thing on the board, or a king and a pawn and another thing on the board. Let's just say a pawn, so we'll include all the cases. You have a king and a pawn and something else on the board, and you're not winning. That's a hint. I'm gonna include all pawns. So see how many cases you can come up with. You can pause the video. You can take a couple hours, discuss with your friends. How many ways can you have a king and a pawn and something else on the board where you're not losing them and you can't win? All right. So let me show you what I think are the cases for this. And some of them are going to have similar cases where if you came up with an answer that was almost identical, of course, we're talking the same thing. All right, so the most famous case is the wrong color rook pawn. Remember I said let's not exclude rook pawns? So here, the pawn is queening on a dark square. So let's say you have a light squared bishop. Okay, white plays king g2, king h4, king h2, king g5, king up, king back. You can move the king first, you can move the pawn first, it doesn't matter. And what's going to happen here is black's going to go in the corner, and if you bring your king up and you check him and he goes here, you can't push the pawn at stalemate. And if you move the bishop away and now you push the pawn and he goes in the corner, you either have to let the king go to g7 forever and get a draw, or you can stalemate him if you don't let him go to g7. So if you have a bishop and a rook pawn, and the pawn's promoting to a square that's the opposite color of the bishop, it's a draw. That's probably the most famous case. The other famous case where you have a king and a pawn and something else and you can't win is with two rook pawns. So let's put a pawn on h2 and an h4. Doesn't matter where the kings are as long as the defending king can get to the corner. Something like this. The black king just runs into the corner just like he could have with the bishop. And the extra tempo with the pawn doesn't help you now. And if you push the pawn, you're going to run into these stalemate problems. But pushing the other pawn doesn't help. Tempos are not an issue. And this is a draw too. So that's the most famous, where in both cases we're allowing rook pawns. But what other cases could you possibly be in where you have a king and a pawn and something else on the board and you're not winning? Okay, the next four cases are the tricky ones. So let's talk about the least tricky of those four cases. And that would be king on d6, black king on e8, white pawn on e7, and a white pawn on e5. Now, if you set up something like this and you use the d file instead of the e file, that's the same case, all right? We're talking about all the cases where there's a pawn on the 7th and there's a pawn on the same file on the 5th, and the king, it's white's move, and white has a choice of what he can do. Well, if he pushes the pawn to e6, it's a stalemate. If he moves the king to e6, it's a stalemate. But if he moves the king back and he lets black take the pawn, if you watched my earlier videos or you know king and pawn endgames, you know that if black plays perfectly here, it's a draw. For instance, e6, king to e8, king d6, king d8, check, here, draw. White can move his king away and let him take the pawn, or he can stalemate him. It's his choice. If he doesn't ever push that pawn, he can get a threefold repetition of position by simply black keep going straight back here. If black goes back diagonal, he loses. If you don't believe me, you can check out the other video. And eventually you push the pawn if you don't want to draw. All right, so this position, white to play, is a draw. And if you had a similar position, let's mirror that position, for instance. We'll mirror the position on the other side of the board. Very identical type of case here. White to play. This is a draw. All right, so that's three cases now where white can have a king and a pawn and something else on the board and he's not winning. What other kind of case could there be? Well, suppose you have a king and a knight and a rook pawn. A king and a knight and a rook pawn can beat a king in a normal case. So let's show you that. It's pretty easy. So here white would play king g4, king back, pawn up. Sorry, king g5, pawn up, king here, he's in Zugzwang here, king here. And now where we want our knight is f7. So we play knight g5, he plays there, knight f7. He can't go in the corner, he has to go away, and you push the pawn and you win. So if you wait till the knight can get to f7 and you wait with the pawn on h6, you're okay. But suppose you push the pawn too fast. Suppose you get to a position like this. All right, so let's say our king has to come over. Well, this looks pretty good for white. His knight is guarding the pawn. The king can't take the pawn because the knight's guarding it. And the king can never take the knight because the pawn will get a queen. But the problem is, if white starts bringing his king up here, how does he guard his h-pawn with the king so he can move the knight away and win without stalemating black? If he brings the king up here, it's stalemate. So let's say he waits and black comes up. Well, he still can't move the knight away because black will take the pawn. So white waits some more and black goes here and he still can't move the knight away. And if he guards the pawn, it's stalemate. So this is a case where white has pushed this pawn too soon and black has a draw even though black cannot take the knight, he can't take the pawn, they're both safe. But white can't win because the pawn got pushed too fast. So it is possible with a rook pawn and a knight to not win if you push the pawn to the 7th rank too fast. So this is an example, again, of a king and a pawn against a king and a pawn and something else on the board against a king, and you're not winning. Now, in so far, 3 of our 4 examples have used rook pawns, and that's true. That's why I made sure at the start to say, yes, it's not restricted on what kind of pawns that you're going to use. All right, so we're still looking for more cases where a king and a pawn and something else against a king don't win. And the 5th one that I came up with is a famous tempo puzzle. So we'll put a black knight on h8, put a black king on a1. So here we're going to have black have the extra pawn. We can switch the colors. It doesn't matter. Okay, black's trying to queen his a pawn. So black's got a pawn and he's got a knight. And the way black can win is to guard the square the king is going to go to. So the white king can't get to that square and he has to go away and let the black king out of the corner. The problem is if it's black's move here, he's going to have to go from a black square to a white square. Knights always reverse colors when they make a move. So here, a knight on a dark square has to go to a white square. But when he goes to a light square, he's guarding a dark square, but he wants to guard a light square. So white will move to a light square. Now black wants to go to a light square so he can guard a dark square. But all the squares he can go to are dark squares. Now white will move to a dark square, and now black wants to go to a dark square so he can guard this light square. But he can't, because now he has to move his knight to a light square. And now white will have to go to a white square. Black can go to a dark square and check him, but he doesn't want to check him. He wants to put him in Zugzwang. Instead, he wants to guard that square, not check that square. And when white goes here, black would love to pass here and say, I pass, your turn, and I win. But black has to make a move. Well, he has to move his knight from a dark square to a light square. And if he does, then white can get the king out, and black's king and pawn can never get out. So in this case, with black to play, it's a draw. Now, how can we change the position so that black can win here? Well, we could change it in 3 different ways. First, we could make it white's move instead of black's move. If it's white's move, then white has to go to a white square, and now black has what he wants. He can go to a white square that guards a dark square, and that means eventually he can come up and guard that square. There we go. And he's guarding that square, and white has to move away. Doesn't matter where he goes. Black goes here, gets his queen, and he wins. So if we make it white's move instead of black's move, that'll do it. How else could we do it? Well, we could still leave it as black's move, but we could start the king on the white square. All right, now it's black to play, and black can again win. King here, knight there, king here, knight here, king here, knight here, king here, knight to e3, or knight to b4, and it guards that square, and he wins. So if the king starts on c2, then it's a win. How else could we change the position from black to move in this position and it's a draw? The last thing we could do is put the knight on a different color and make it black's move. If we put black on a light square and start, now he should be able to do it. Wait, black moves first, knight here, king here, knight here, and he can't go there. King can't go to c2, and black wins. So in this position, with black to move, it's a draw. But if it was white's move, or if white's king was on c2, or if black's knight was on any white square instead of a dark square, then black would be winning. So this is my 5th case, where you have a king and a pawn and something else on the board, and yet you still can't win. And for a while, I thought these were the only 5 that I could come up with. And then I was looking at an endgame book, and they were talking about some rare endgames, when all of a sudden I saw another case. where you could have a king and a pawn and something else on the board against a king and you couldn't win. And the position was something like this. Let me clear the board. The king, well, this time we'll do with black's king. So king is on g7 and white has a pawn on g6 and a bishop on h7 and his king is somewhere. Okay, so white's problem is he wants to be able to zugzwang the black king away from these squares, but he has to be able to save the bishop to do that. So let's ask Stockfish here. Let's turn on our analysis engine. All right, so you can see Stockfish says this is a draw. King up, king back, king up, king up, king up, king back. So obviously we can't come up to h6. It's a draw. So let's say we wait. King f5 here. Well, how do we get our bishop out? If we play bishop here, black has to be careful about the tempos, but here he can take the bishop, and when the king comes up, he can go here. What about if the king was on a different square when white does that? Well, let's say the king is here, and black goes here, and now white goes here. Can black still take? Yes, he can. He takes, draw. So how can he get the bishop out? King f6 is a stalemate, so we can't play f6 here. Can we march our king closer around some other way? King here. See, every time we put the bishop here now, it doesn't matter. He can just take the pawn, and we can't mate him with a king and a bishop against the pawn. So as you can see, Stockfish says this position is a draw. So now we have 6. There's 6 cases, and there's similar ones. As I said, you could come up with one that's almost exactly the same. They would count as the same if it's the same idea. So let's review what those 6 are. We're looking for 6 cases where you have a king and a pawn and something else on the board, and you're not losing one of them, and yet he can't win. All right, let me bring the board up to full size here. Okay, back out this way. All right, let's review what the 6 are. So we're looking for cases where king and pawn and something else don't win. Clear the board. All right, the first case we looked at was king, rook, pawn, and bishop that does not cover the promoting square when the king is here. There are some clever puzzles, for instance. Let's show you a puzzle here, as long as we have a little extra time. So white's king is here, white's pawn is here, black's king is here, white's bishop is here. Okay, so this is white to play and win. How can white win? Well, it's actually easy to figure out. If black gets his king into the corner, it's a draw. So you have to be able to make a move. Well, let's put the king up 1 just to make it easier. You have to make a move that keeps the king from getting to the corner. If you play h7, he can go to the corner, and even though you guard the pawn, it's a draw. So what you do is you play bishop to e6 check. Now he cannot go to that g8 square. Clearly he can't take the pawn because he's outside the box. There's the box, he can't get in it. So he can't take the bishop. But then after he goes here, white to play and win, well, everybody here plays king g6, but what I play here is I move my king the opposite direction. King f4. And now black's in zugzwang. He can't go to f7, he can't go to g7, he can't go to g8, so he has to move even further away from the pawn, and when he does that, I get a queen. So I don't even need my king here. My bishop and my pawn are doing the job. I just need to put him in zugzwang. So the answer is bishop checks, king here, and then any king move. You can move up if you wanted to. I think it's kind of more clever to move back. And black's in zugzwang, he has to move away from the corner, and white gets a queen. All right, so that's an example where you can win, but if he can get to the corner, if we change this puzzle and put the king on g8 already, now it's a dead draw. He's going to get to the corner. It doesn't matter what you do. You can check him, and now you got to let him out. This is a dead draw. All right, so that's case 1. Case 2 is similar, but not the same kind of case. It's where you have 2 rook pawns. You can't win. Those are the 2 most famous. Then we had the third case, which was pawn on the 5th, pawn on the 7th on the same file, where they're not rook pawns. It's white's move. If it was black's move, it'd be a trivial win for white. King f7, king d7, white wins. But it's white's move. He either has to go into a drawn king and pawn endgame, or he's got to stalemate him, or he's got to stalemate him. But white to play in this position cannot win. So that was case 3. Case 4 was the knight with the rook pawn, where the pawn is already too far advanced and the king can get to the corner. Both the knight and the pawn are safe, but it doesn't help white, even though they're both safe. Black's king goes in the corner, and white can't safely guard. It doesn't matter whose move it is. King up, king in the corner. Okay, and that was case 4. Case 5 was, we'll do it with white this time. White has a knight, black has a king, white has a pawn, white has a king. What white wants to do is move his knight to a light square so he can guard a dark square. But he has a parity problem. He's on the wrong parity. He keeps moving to black, and then black moves to black, and then white moves to a light square, and black moves to a light square, and white can check him, but he doesn't want to check him. He wants to guard the square now, but he can't. It's white's turn, and he can't pass here. He has to go to a light square, and no matter how he does this, he could dance around all day. The parity is wrong. He can never guard a dark square. So in this position, white to play is a draw. And then finally, we had the case where the bishop is on h7, pawn is on g6, the king is defending on the dark squares, doesn't matter where the white king is, and white's king can't get in, and he can't get the bishop out in a way to get him the tempos. So he can try sacking the bishop in some tempo lines, but there's no line where he can win unless black plays very poorly. So black with correct play here gets a draw. So this is 6 different cases where white has a king and white has a pawn and white has something else on the board and he can't win. And it all started with how I like to play this kind of position here. As I said, when I have the 2 pawns, and it doesn't matter, it doesn't have to be a rook pawn, it could be any pawn, I just push one of the pawns up the board, preferably not a rook pawn, of course. And I just say, as long as I got that other thing on the board, I can always use it as a tempo machine. I just have to not guard the square. Play here, he goes there. Okay, I got it. King up, and I win. So based on that, this guy here could be anything, really. As long as I have something that can create a tempo without stalemating him, I can win. The king and the non-rook pawn will always win with a non-tempo piece. And then the question is, all right, but if we just generally say a king and a pawn, and it could be a rook pawn, and something else on the board, when am I not winning? I found those 6 cases. There may be a 7th case, but I found those 6. And in those 6 cases, the king and the pawn and the extra piece, the extra thing, whatever it is, can't beat the king. Okay, so I think that's a really interesting case. So now you know, if you transpose into an endgame where you have a king and a pawn and anything else on the board and they're all safe, then unless you run into one of these 6 cases, if you play right, you're always winning. You have enough material to win the game, checkmate the opposing king. All right, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, you can hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, Dan Heisman Chess, here on YouTube, you can hit the subscribe button. And we try to put out a video every once in a while. We have some back videos that are cover all kinds of things involved with improvement, from time management to king and pawn endgames to how to learn openings to some of the world's most famous games to some of my best games to some amateur games. we got a little of everything to help you get better. You can browse through my channel and find it. As I just tweeted on my chest tip of the day on YouTube, if you don't follow me on YouTube, I'm at Dan Heisman. My first dozen videos or so, I was using a regular mic, and people said the audio wasn't that great. So I switched to a professional level mic, and ever since then, people have said that the sound is good. So if you check out some of my first few videos, and you don't think the sound is as good as it is on this one, well, that's only true for the first few videos. Then after that, I switched. So I think this is my 107th or 108th video. So most of them, of course, have good quality and sound. All right, hope to see everybody next time. Thanks a lot. Please be safe. We're still in the middle of the coronavirus problem, of course. And hopefully everybody out there is well and safe. Bye.